Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Sojourning Writer. Today we're going to be taking a look at what we learned in the previous lesson, and we're actually going to build character sheets that express the needs of our characters. This will help us guide us as we write these characters in their interpersonal connections and their conflicts that arise because of these unmet needs. So why don't we first go into the main character, Stephen Johnson. Basically, this is a character that I wrote for what's currently a shelved work in progress, but I wanted to do something that I could actually have the experience. I've actually worked through this character for a first draft and will be able to have a better understanding. So this is where I'm coming from when I talk about these needs. So one of the things here we need to make sure is that every book genre has specific expectations for the reader what to expect. So having the book genre on here is really important for me because it helps me understand, because something like fantasy is going to have a different perspective on how needs are being viewed and met. If you see here, it says number one need for this book is survive. Now in say a romance, survival isn't a key need throughout the whole story. Whereas in this case, a fantasy, it is important, particularly when that has to be what's implied the biggest when it comes to how the main character is going to be interacting with the world. The character status is also important. The protagonist, or the main character, MC for short, he has the specific roles and his needs are going to be more important from the reader's perspective than somebody who's a side character. Gender, sex and gender are also going to play a huge part in how this character's interacting with the world, because for guys they have different needs than women. Any relationship book will tell you that. Any observance of reality in relationships and the difficulties that can arise from unmet needs on both sides, we need to know where we're starting out with our perspective. Race, white, Scotch Irish. From somebody who's in a majority country that has your similar skin tone, you're going to have different needs than you are if you are not. So a black person in the American society is going to have a different needs and perspective on reality than somebody who's white. That's just the nature of it. Scotch Irish kind of gives you a little bit more history, so it's kind of not necessarily critical importance as far as his race, but it adds connections to him to the story later on. A socioeconomic status, where somebody lies on the socioeconomic hierarchy, really does play a part in how they view the world. And some needs are being met as opposed to somebody else. So if you have somebody who made a lot of money, whether it's through luck or hard work, their needs are going to change depending on how they made that money, if they have enough money, because the more money you have to a certain point, it reduces the amount of overall stresses that you have. Now, if it's somebody who wants to make a lot of money, that's going to be different in their needs, because somebody has a drive to make money, to make a lot of money. They're going to have different need than somebody who's just been given the money in their lap. College education, education level. Obviously, depending on the story, it varies from world to world. So basically, in this situation, we have somebody who's college educated, has a history degree. History degree from the get-go is not something that is going to provide a lot of money. STEM degrees like science, technology, engineering, and math have a much higher return on investment when it comes to how much money is being paid. Somebody with a history degree, chances are, unless they go into teaching and they have like a master's degree, they're not going to make a whole lot of money as opposed to how much they spent on that degree. Parentage, that plays a huge role in how your character is going to view the world. Happy family is going to have a different perspective as somebody who's orphaned, per se. That's why I put parentage here, because parentage is one of those things that can set up a character long term of what their needs are going to look like. Here he has a father, but he has a stepmom. Well, why doesn't he have a mom? Why doesn't he have, somebody, the person who gave birth to him? Why isn't she in the picture? And that plays into how they need to interact with the main character and sets up the issues and drama for later on in the story. As you're showing this over the period of time, this information isn't something that you're necessarily going to be just dropping a ton like in a block of text, but rather sprinkling it in throughout the story. Now, personality traits, this is one of the first videos that I did. How open are they to ideas? How creative they are specifically when it comes to openness. Conscientiousness. How particular are they on staying on top of things? How analytical are they about keeping things in order? How orderly they are. Extroversion, how well they interplay with people. How well do they have the experience? And that's literally what part of extroversion is that people who have higher extroversion have more practice interacting with people and learning how to communicate. A lot of the issues that we see today when it comes to extroversion versus introversion, or skills, or a lot of the things that we see when it comes to people being better, people attributing that to, hey, they're gifted, or they have something special about them. And I don't believe that's actually the case. I believe that people who devote time and effort into what they're looking to do are going to be automatically better off because they have the practice. Practice is what actually gives you the ability to increase your skill, to hone your skills. Agreeableness here. With agreeableness, we got to make sure that how well they play with each other. Not just about how they can talk to people or how they can interact, but rather how do they actually handle dealing with disagreeable people? Are they polite? Are they impolite? Are they more, prone to roll over than to stand up for themselves? Then neuroticism. We're talking about whether or not they have issues in the past that, on one hand, are creating this environment where they are struggling for needs. Everybody has a certain level of neuroticism. There's nobody that doesn't have it. And as a character, that neuroticism can give us a little bit more to play with. Now, for needs, there are different types of needs, and I have all of these needs broken up into an overall need. Starting needs, these are needs that are in the first act that you're introducing your character to that they didn't know they needed before. Second act needs. These are needs where they've done some growth and they've been dealing with the needs that they have, but those needs are being changed up because as needs are being met or being taken care of, in this case, we're talking about learning about the world. A little bit about this story, it's a portal story for sort of like Chronicles of Narnia or Lion, Witch, and a Wardrobe. Those are portal stories where you take one character and you move them to another. There's other terms for it, but that's the one that probably I think most people are going to understand. So when you take a character that's lived in a modern Earth, they're going to need to relearn how the world works. And by doing that, we are learning how the world works. And we are learning about how this world is different from the one that we understand ourselves. This creates a desire to learn more. It engages the side of us that we want to learn. Learning how to take care of himself. Starts off when we first meet the character, when he's not somebody that takes care of himself. He doesn't have those healthy mindsets that allows him to be more than just a slob, for lack of a better term. And learning how to lead war. These are generalships. These are tactical maneuvers. These are things that he's learning very early that he has to engage with. And these top three needs are just that. They're top three. Everybody has needs that flow in and out of what's the priority. In Act 2, as he's growing, as he's developing, as he's dealing with these needs up here, learning about the world, learning how to take care of himself, and learning how to lead, these are things that he is dealing with, that he can, reduce these, lower these down on the priority. Granted, there might not be a whole lot of difference to the average reader about learning to lead a war versus how to lead others. There's so much that goes into leading a war that it's easy to forget that leading others is more important. So this is something that he's learning. Hey, this is not about knowing the tactics. This is not about knowing the philosophy of combat, but rather how to get people to do what you need them to do. And that's literally what this is. Leadership is, in some senses, a form of manipulation, but a manipulation that is for the benefit of everybody, not just the person doing the manipulation. We want to be able to say, hey, I want you to want to do something. And that's what this is. This is concept of leadership, learning how to stay humble. In this case, he knows he needs to learn how to stay humble. The thing is that it's, in this case, we don't necessarily need him to learn how to do it properly. He knows he needs how to do it. One of the things is that sometimes learning things and learning how to do things correctly are two different things. In this situation here, learning how to stay humble, we can have a character that says, hey, I'm going to be learning how to stay humble in this very specific way that may not be healthy. In this case here, the way that he tries to stay humble is by self-defeating talk to himself, non-positive self-talk, talking himself down, try to humble himself so he's not seen as being arrogant. Now, long-term, that's an unhealthy way of handling it, but it might be seen as a short-term way of, hey, I don't want to be like those guys over there that are arrogant. So how do I make sure I don't become arrogant? Part of arrogance is entitlement. How do I make sure I'm not entitled? I talk down to myself. I talk down to myself so that I don't think I'm better than anybody else. That's not a healthy way of staying humble. Humility is something completely different. Humility is understanding that where you are is not as close as you are to the idea of perfection. Keeping the mindset of perfection as something you're striving towards, not something that you are being. You are never going to be perfect. So recognizing how far you've come and recognizing how far you have to go to the idea of perfect is a much better way of seeing what humility actually is. A lot of people don't realize that. Learning to listen to others. It's easy for somebody who's arrogant to say, hey, I have the right answer. Now, somebody like this case where he's thrown into a medieval world and he has an education and he knows more than pretty much everybody else, it's easy for him to throw out the idea of, hey, you don't know what you're talking about because I have an education. That's a arrogance that he doesn't necessarily realize that will cause problems for him when he tries to do this first point, learn how to lead others. These are all part and parcel of the same mindset as he's learning it. These are not individual elements that are disconnected from each other, but rather they are sort of weaved together through the story and how he overcomes these shortcomings. Not to say that, like we're talking about here, where he is shown as doing it properly. He kind of shortcuts it in a way that's not healthy. Sort of like you have somebody who's wants to lose weight and all they do is starve themselves. That's not a healthy way of losing weight. But what we can do here is show, hey, this is not a good thing, and we can show why it's not a good thing and leave it for another time, another issue when we can actually have the character learn the proper way of staying humble. Now, Act 3 is learning how to deal with tragedy. You know, that's part of what Act 2 and Act 3 are, is and we'll go over this later when it comes to actually formatting your story. Tragedy is something when you overcome, where you have a difficulty that you don't think you can deal with what's going on. And learning how to deal with that is something that everybody has to do at some point, whether it's death of friends, death of loved ones, family sicknesses and whatnot. These are tragedies that we go through that we have to learn how to deal with. Now, everybody who goes through these problems, they're dealing it with their own ways. And a lot of times we don't know how to deal with it properly. So we find shortcuts, like when I talk about his learning how to stay humble. Is he going to learn how to deal with this tragedy properly, or is he going to self-destruct? And then going back to the second act, is he going to lead with no one following? It's easy to lead when people are saying, encouraging you, and enforcing what you believe. It's a lot easier to do it when you have a following. But the problem is that as a leader, you have to be able to step out alone. You have to start off learning how to do things alone. And this, while it's not as much as living alone physically, but emotionally, and learning how to live alone without like a love interest. It's so easy for people to think, hey, I need to make sure that I have a love interest. I need to make sure that I am doing something that allows me to have those physical connections with a romantic person or a romantic interest with somebody else. That solves a lot of the needs. The problem is that's not always the case. And when we allow our needs to control us and not see them as, hey, yes, I have this need, but I'm going to put it on the back burner to deal with other stuff. This allows us to handle what's in front of us while not allowing those needs that we have to overtake us and cause problems in the long term. And we're going to have unmet needs. Throughout the story, you're always going to have unmet needs because nobody's needs are ever truly satisfied. Particularly in a story where you're talking about somebody who is achieving and sacrificing. Sacrifice is a part and parcel of the hero's journey. So sacrificing is something that you have, hey, I'm giving up this thing to achieve this better thing. I have a need that I'm forsaking, a want, a need. They're kind of interchangeable. I'm giving up this thing I have now for the sake of the future. And this is going to be particularly true if you do more than one book. My plan always was to have this as a series, not a long series. I'm not a huge fan of book series that keep on going that don't have an endpoint. I already have an endpoint in mind when it comes to the story. So you need to make sure that you have needs that are, particularly in the case of book series, you have to have needs that are unmet, that will allow your character to connect to the readers as they are going from book to book in your story. Now, every need that you express, every need that you're talking about at the beginning, there needs to be a level of resolution. You can't just say, hey, this person needs to do this thing. This person needs to achieve this thing. And if you go 2, 3, 4 books without that resolution, then you're going to lose your readers because they're going to feel dragged along, especially if you aren't giving them other resolutions. It's one thing if the overarching one isn't 100% completed. It's another thing entirely if you don't give them any resolutions to any of the needs that you express throughout the story. There's idea of keeping your promises. Brandon Sanderson has talked about, and we'll go over his videos later, talking about making promises and keeping your promises. And that's one of the things that you do here with their needs. You show the need, and then you resolve the need. You help them overcome that need, or you fulfill that need, so it's no longer sitting up at the top. These needs here aren't going to be something that you will necessarily explicitly say, but if you do it right, if you have the people who have read your book and show them this list, they can think back of the story and say, yes, I can see how you expressed each one of these needs in your story. And then there's always going to be unknown needs that the character themselves isn't going to truly know and truly understand, that we as readers should be able to pick up. I talked about earlier about learning what humility is. That's part of the unknown needs. Learning what a healthy romantic love is. Seeing how actual people should be engaging with one another, and then learning how to walk alone. These are these are touchstones of things that I mentioned earlier. So now that we have an idea of what this looks like, particularly for this character, we can pull out another character, somebody else who I wrote as a love interest. And see, hey, kind of showing the differences that we can show. So, book fantasy, love interest, side character named Cassandra, female, biracial, white father, black mother. This is going to change how they're going to be viewing themselves. These are all elements that make up a character, a good character. These aren't cardboard cutouts on the page. These aren't just words on the page, but rather We're showing how these people actually are dealing with the issues that they have. Socioeconomic status, the princess. Princess is an easy one to do because there are expectations for a princess. There are different expectations for a prince. But because we're starting off with somebody who doesn't have the same needs as, say, a peasant, this allows us to have a lot more playroom when it comes to how we're going to express other aspects. Because when it comes to the need of needing resources, which a princess is going to need, that's going to suck up a lot of the mindset for them. If we remove the idea of them having a need for specific things, we are allowed to explore other aspects of their needs. So their education, high female noble. What does that look like in this world? Do they go to a school? Is there a same, what does history teach us about it? Parentage, having a mother and father present. Those are big things. For here, openness means they're not really open to new experiences. Their conscientiousness is very high. So they're talking about, what we're talking about here is having somebody who is very particular about how they do things. Extroversion, they can talk to people, they can manipulate people. Agreeableness, when somebody pushes back on them, how quickly are they to agree to it, or are they more willing to be disagreeable? High levels of neuroticism, how does their history, how does their interaction with the world actually play out? In the world that we're talking about here, it's a majority white kingdom. So how does a biracial woman, female, how is that expressed in how she sees the world? How does she view herself when it comes to that? Overall seat, she needs to be accepted. By having a character who's different from the majority, this creates a otherness when it comes to how they perceive themselves with the situation that they're in. This is not necessarily something that you're going to see when you're a lot younger, but as you get older, it becomes a lot more evident, particularly if you deal with people who are less accepting. You're always going to have people who are racist. That's just going to be the nature of otherings that we are going to deal with until, the end of time. You're always going to find people who are going to separate themselves away from other people based on immutable characteristics. Racism is just one of those things that we see more today than you might see in other places. To be in control, somebody who has a high level of conscientiousness, somebody who requires a lot of control. This allows her to control not just herself, but everything around her. Because of her high neuroticism, this means that she is going to be demanding or implying or manipulating people to get what she wants, so that she is seen, particularly seen as productive. Because if it's a healthy relationship, because she loves her father, the king, she doesn't want to be seen as somebody who is unproductive. Starting needs to be seen as productive. Some needs stay throughout it. They might move up and down on that list, but sometimes they stay on that. Second one, how to learn how to interact with other people correctly. When you have somebody who has a high level of control, they are more willing to actually deal with them in a manipulation and a negative manipulation way, rather than leading them. Rather, try to get what they want out of them, treating people like disposable people. This is something that sometimes happens when somebody who has a negative self or a high level of neuroticism, they're far more willing to start manipulating people for their own protection, to be comfortable in their own skin. This is somebody who is uncomfortable in the fact that they are outside the norm. Being outside the norm is not an easy thing to deal with, regardless of the skin color. It would be the same as somebody who was white being in a majority black country. They're going to feel othered. Learning how to be adaptable. Second act is learning how to be adaptable, giving up the control. Being comfortable in your own skin is just one part of learning how to ignore others who don't accept you. There are people that talk about self-love, and I don't think necessarily self-love is necessarily the best way of talking about it. But what we can discuss is hey, there's always going to be people who are going to not like you for unreasonable reasons. So how do you handle that? Number one is ignore them. Figuring out ways of making sure that you are not being held up by their perspective. Then Act 3, we're talking about a story where they're not the main character. The main character doesn't even necessarily need to show up in Act 3. And a lot of these, the more closer they are to the main character, the more time they spend on the page, the more this information should be at least understood from the writer's perspective. Even if these things don't end up on the page themselves, knowing how these persons are going to be interacting is going to be a key to having believable confrontations when those needs are not met, rather. For instance, there's a scene early on in the book where I have the main character needs to be presented to a party of nobles, a feast where nobles are going to be. There was a miscommunication, and the main character wasn't actually officially invited by the princess who was organizing this feast. So because the main character is dealing with his own issues, he has his own level of neuroticism, he doesn't want to actually go to the party, and because he wasn't officially invited, that gives him an out. Now, for him, he's trying to overcome the past, trying to deal with, learning how to deal with, hey, this is the way I've been treating in the past. Way I learned how to deal with it might not necessarily be the best way of handling it. Whereas for her, she needs to be accepted. She needs to be seen as productive. She needs to be in control. So somebody who needs to be in control, when the main character doesn't show up to a feast that was made for him and it was made clear to him that it was there for him, her neuroticism is going to shoot through the roof. Her ability to handle what's going on is going to cause problems, and she's going to look at it from her own perspective of, he's just not doing what he should be doing. From her perspective, she's seeing he's causing problems because he wants to get back at me. There's anger, there's frustration for her, and her dealing with him and his issues. His needs aren't being met because, as we show here, feeling wanted. When somebody doesn't get invited to a party, they don't feel wanted. And when you have somebody, and it kind of goes back to the stepmom, why does he have a stepmom rather than a mom? These are things that you're going to sprinkle throughout the story, and you're like, oh, that's why he's acting the way he acts. That's why he deals with the problems that he deals with. And I'm, as a writer, showing the reader, hey, these are why he is acting the way he's acting. This is not something that we dump out on the page. This is something that we give a very decent look at the main character at the beginning, and then we sprinkle in this backstory as we go along. And doing that takes a lot of skill, and it's not something that's easy. But understanding the needs is one of those early things that we have to make sure that we're paying attention to in how the characters are expressed on the page. All right, so that's enough for today. So hopefully you'll join me next time on Friday when I drop the next video. All right, have a good one. Bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.